At 75, André Rieu, the world's most beloved waltz king, has finally broken his silence. Known for his charm, elegance, and orchestral magic, Rieu was never one to stir controversy. But behind the sweeping violins and standing ovations, tension brewed for decades. Now, in a moment of raw honesty, he's naming names. 5 singers, famous, celebrated, and once close, who crossed a line he could never forgive. From diva demands to silent betrayals, this is the truth Rieu kept quiet until now. Get ready for a side of the maestro you've never seen, because behind the bow, there was always a battle. Katherine Jenkins, the spotlight seeker. Back in 2009, André Rieu was preparing for one of his signature concerts in Maastricht. The setting was like something from a dream. Grand lighting rigs, his beloved Johann Strauss orchestra tuning their instruments, and the warm, expectant energy that always came before a show. But this time, there was a new guest, one who would change the mood the moment she arrived. Katherine Jenkins. Jenkins, already a classical crossover star with a strong fan base in the UK, was invited to bring a fresh voice to Rieu's performance. At first, it made sense. Her voice had power, clarity, and charm. But what Rieu didn't expect was the presence behind the voice, a personality that didn't just walk into the room, but took it over. From the beginning, things felt off. Jenkins reportedly brought in her own team, stylists, lighting consultants, and even her own vocal coach. That was unusual in Rieu's world. His shows were about teamwork, about the orchestra breathing as one unit. Jenkins? She wanted the spotlight. Literally, she requested brighter stage lights during her solos. She asked for multiple retakes during rehearsals if she didn't feel captured properly. And while the orchestra had been trained to work around each other's space, Jenkins reportedly insisted on center stage, even during full ensemble numbers. One technician recalled she wanted a golden wash on her face and a tighter spotlight. That's not how André does things. The maestro himself was polite, measured, but observant. He later said in private conversation, she chased the spotlight more than the harmony. The tension didn't explode. It just lingered. Musicians felt uneasy. Rieu, a master of balance and mood, began to sense the emotional rhythm of the show slipping, and what was meant to be a long-standing collaboration quickly cooled. A planned joint tour was quietly shelved. Jenkins's name vanished from press announcements and promotional posters. Fans began to ask questions. Why didn't Katherine return? Was something wrong? But there were no public answers, just silence. And that's how André Rieu works. He never aired dirty laundry in public. For years, he said nothing, never blamed, never corrected the rumors. But behind the scenes, the message was clear. This wasn't about talent. It was about fit. Jenkins had the voice, but not the humility. And for a man like Rieu, who built his career on shared joy, mutual respect, and classical grace, that mattered more than star power. So she was left off future tours, not blacklisted, but forgotten. And when Rieu finally opened up at 75 about the singers who disappointed him most, Jenkins's name came up almost immediately. Not because of a dramatic blow-up, but because of a slow erosion of trust and chemistry. Some voices are beautiful, he said, but if they can't blend, they break the whole thing. That quiet decision echoed louder than any feud. Sarah Brightman, the crossover conflict. The invitation was bold. André Rieu wanted to do something different, something that would bring classical music to a younger, broader crowd. Enter Sarah Brightman, a global soprano who had sold millions of albums with her theatrical blend of opera and pop. On paper, it was a perfect match. Both artists were known for grand performances and pushing musical boundaries. But once rehearsals began, it became clear they were not in sync. Brightman came in with her own interpretation of the classics. When she suggested a reimagining of Blue Danube, the crown jewel of Rieu's concert repertoire, eyebrows were raised. Her version included a modern beat, electronic layering, and background visuals that resembled a pop concert. more than a waltz. The orchestra followed directions, but the mood changed. André, always focused on elegance and emotional depth, reportedly sat in silence after the run-through. "That wasn't fusion, that was dilution," he later told a colleague. During the performance itself, the audience was captivated, but divided. Younger fans applauded the remix. Older fans looked stunned. Critics were mixed. Some called it innovative. Others said Rieu had let go of his musical roots for commercial appeal. And the maestro? He stayed silent. There was no second invitation. Behind the scenes, the clash wasn't personal. It was artistic. Rieu valued tradition, cohesion, and reverence for the classics. Brightman, with her dramatic flair and pop crossover instincts, represented a different world. Her team pitched more collaborations afterward, new shows, duets, even a holiday tour, but none of it went anywhere. It was over before it even began. When Rieu reflected later, her name surfaced quickly, not out of hatred, but disappointment. "There's a difference between bringing something new," he said, "and rewriting what doesn't need fixing." The fallout was quiet, but total. Their one performance became a one-off. No reunions, no shared tours, just a brief, dazzling, and ultimately divisive flash in the spotlight. Anna Netrebko, the Ice Queen soprano. When Anna Netrebko joined André Rieu for a special concert series in 2011, it was a moment of prestige. Netrebko was a towering figure in opera, her technique flawless, her reputation untouchable. Fans were thrilled at the pairing, but from the first rehearsal, the chemistry felt cold. Netrebko sang with mechanical perfection. Every note was placed precisely, every phrase executed with textbook control. But Rieu, ever the emotional conductor, felt something missing. "She sang like a machine, not a soul," he told a friend backstage. The audience picked up on it too. While applause came, it felt more like respect than joy. Critics noted that while Netrebko's voice soared, the connection with the orchestra and the audience fell flat. The warmth, the intimacy that Rieu's concerts were famous for, just wasn't there. Netrebko's team dismissed any issues. They chalked it up to artistic differences, saying her voice spoke for itself. But privately, Rieu made a decision. He didn't want perfection without heart. He wanted passion, expression, connection. The kind of music that made people cry, not just clap. Their time together was short. After that performance series, Netrebko was never invited back. No public drama, just another silent goodbye. And years later, when Rieu finally opened up about the artists who left him cold, her name came up quickly. Not because of scandal, but because no matter how technically brilliant, her presence created distance rather than unity. Haley Westenra, the fallen protege. She was just 17 when André Rieu first brought her on stage. Haley Westenra, a soft-spoken soprano from New Zealand, had the voice of an angel and the charm to match. Rieu took her under his wing, mentoring her through early performances, helping shape her path as a rising classical star. For a while, it was a perfect match, until it wasn't. As her fame grew, so did her demands. By the time she turned 20, things started to shift. Contract talks became tense. Her management pushed for solo billing, higher fees, and more creative control. Rieu, who had once seen her as a daughter figure, began feeling like an outsider in her rising career. Then came the breaking point, a UNICEF charity concert arranged by Rieu himself. Westenra pulled out last minute. No explanation, no apology. Just a polite message from her team. For Rieu, it wasn't just unprofessional, it was personal. "She broke more than a contract. She broke our trust," he said later. The disappointment lingered. He had seen promise, humility, and grace in her, only to watch it vanish in the glow of fame. After that, he became more guarded. He avoided mentoring young soloists for years. Westenra continued her career, but never again appeared with Rieu. Their story became a cautionary tale about trust, about loyalty, and about how quickly rising stars can drift from the people who first believed in them. Russell Watson, the leaky tenor. Russell Watson came to André Rieu's world with a big voice and a bigger nickname, the People's Tenor. He was well known in Britain, celebrated for bridging classical and pop with a humble, down-to-earth persona. But behind the warm smile, something else was brewing. The tour began well enough. Watson blended into rehearsals, hit his notes, played his part. But then the leaks started. Stories appeared in tabloids about backstage tensions, disagreements during rehearsals, and creative differences with Rieu's team. At first, Rieu dismissed it as coincidence, but the pattern became too specific to ignore. Eventually, it was revealed that someone close to Watson had been feeding details to the press. Harmless things at first, what time rehearsals started, what songs were being tested. But then came the gossip: who was unhappy, who had been scolded, which rehearsals were cut short. The private heart of Rieu's operation had been exposed. He smiled for the crowd and whispered to the tabloids. Rieu later admitted, for a conductor who saw his orchestra as a family, it felt like betrayal. Trust was broken, not just with Watson, but within the team. After that tour, Rieu cut ties immediately. No press release, no public fallout. Watson's name was quietly erased from future lineups. Years later, Rieu reflected on the incident. When the music ends, all we have is trust. And once that goes, there's no encore. Carlos Marin, the group Ego. Carlos Marin wasn't just a singer. He was a showman. As the powerhouse voice of Il Divo, he brought drama, charisma, and operatic flair to every stage he touched. So when André Rieu decided to collaborate with the group for a European crossover tour, expectations were sky high. The combination of Il Divo's modern opera vibe with Rieu's grand waltz orchestra felt like a dream pairing until the rehearsals began. The trouble didn't start with arguments. It started with presence. Carlos was magnetic, too magnetic. As the rest of the group tried to blend with Rieu's carefully arranged orchestra, Carlos stood out, not just in vocals, but in energy. He adjusted tempos mid-song, subtly rearranged harmonies, and, according to insiders, began pushing for extended solos that weren't part of the original program. Soon, it became obvious to the orchestra this wasn't about harmony. It was about control. It became the Carlos show, one crew member recalled. Even the group dynamics of Il Divo started to shift around him. André, who had spent his career balancing ego with elegance, felt the tension rising. Performances grew harder to manage. The timing slipped. The synergy that Rieu built with such care began to crack under the weight of showmanship. It wasn't chaos, but it was no longer beautiful. After just 3 shows, the decision was made. Quietly, without any dramatic exit, Rieu pulled the plug on the collaboration. No press statements, no accusations, just a mutual parting that told its own story. Carlos Marin would continue to tour with Il Divo until his tragic passing in 2021. Rieu, on the other hand, learned something lasting from the experience. Some performers don't play with you, they play over you. And that, in his world, was a deal breaker. From then on, André never worked with large vocal groups again. It wasn't personal. It was about protecting the balance he built. The kind of balance that's impossible when one voice tries to outsing an entire orchestra. Andrea Bocelli, the overshadowing icon. When André Rieu invited Andrea Bocelli to co-headline a special outdoor concert, it felt like a moment of classical perfection. 2 giants on one stage, one leading the waltz, the other the aria. The press called it a historic moment. Fans flew in from across the world. But behind the curtain, something was already shifting. The first sign came during rehearsals. Bocelli's set began stretching. What was meant to be a 20-minute solo performance gradually expanded. More songs, longer intros, personal stories between numbers. Rieu adjusted, of course. He always did. But when the final show aired and the press coverage hit, it was clear. It had become Bocelli's night. Headlines barely mentioned Rieu. Social media gushed over Bocelli. The photos? Almost all framed him center stage. Rieu, despite being the host and conductor, had become an afterthought. He didn't lash out. He didn't complain. But privately, those closest to him said he felt gutted. When one voice monopolizes the stage, he reflected later, others are silenced. The collaboration, while visually beautiful and musically rich, was never repeated. Bocelli continued to tour the world as a solo act. Rieu quietly went back to the rhythm he knew best, building shows that celebrated everyone on the stage, not just one star. To this day, Rieu has never criticized Bocelli publicly. There's no feud. But when asked why they never reunited, his answer is telling. The stage is big enough for everyone, but only if you remember to share it. It was a one-time performance that taught him a timeless lesson. Why he stayed silent until now. For decades, André Rieu carried these stories in silence. While others would lash out in interviews or stir headlines with backstage gossip, Rieu always smiled, always thanked the crowd, always kept his orchestra focused on the joy, not the drama. But behind that warm persona was a man who had been disappointed, deeply, more than once. He had every reason to speak earlier. The betrayal by Hayley Westenra, the press leaks with Russell Watson, the ego battles with Marine and Bocelli. But he didn't, because for Rieu, keeping the peace was more important than proving a point. I thought silence was dignity, he once said. But sometimes silence is just fear. Now at 75, something shifted. Age brings reflection, and legacy becomes more important than applause. In recent interviews, Rieu finally opened up, not to name and shame, but to set the record straight, to explain why certain singers never came back, to offer honesty to the fans who'd followed him for decades. The confessions weren't angry. They were soft-spoken, even emotional. He didn't call them enemies. He called them missed chances, collaborations that could have been beautiful if ego hadn't gotten in the way. André knew some would be surprised. Some fans would be disappointed to hear the truth about their favorite stars, but he didn't care about shock. He cared about closure, about lifting the weight of years spent pretending it was all perfect. "This isn't revenge," he said gently. "It's just relief." For the first time, he let truth share the stage with him, and the silence that once protected others, it finally protected him. What all seven had in common. With the names finally out in the open, Katherine Jenkins, Sarah Brightman, Anna Netrebko, Hayley Westenra, Russell Watson, Carlos Marin, and Andrea Bocelli, it became clear that André Rieu wasn't lashing out at isolated moments. He was revealing a pattern. These weren't just one-off conflicts or creative disagreements. They were signs of something deeper, a recurring fracture between ego and ensemble. Each of the seven artists had immense talent. That was never in question. But for Rieu, talent was never the whole story. In fact, it was often the least of the problem. The real issue was behavior, how you showed up off stage, how you treated the orchestra, how you respected the music beyond your own moment in the spotlight. Over the years, these collaborations broke down not because of bad notes, but because of bad timing, bad trust, and unchecked ambition. Rieu valued harmony in every sense of the word, not just in sound, but in spirit. When someone showed up demanding longer solos, controlling the press coverage, or treating rehearsals like obstacles instead of opportunities, it disrupted that harmony. "Talent is not enough without grace," he once told a young singer backstage. That line, repeated by musicians in his circle, became a kind of quiet mantra. It's why Rieu refused to publicly name and shame for so long. Because the issue wasn't always the artist. It was the culture that allowed big egos to go unchecked. Even the audience could feel it. They'd sense when a performance was out of sync, not in tempo, but in tone. When the show felt more like a battle of brands than a shared celebration of music. And when Rieu stepped forward to finally name the pain, it wasn't to blame. It was to teach, to let younger artists know. The music matters, but so does the way you carry it. Across all seven names, there were similar threads: disregard for the orchestra, an obsession with image over impact, and an unwillingness to blend into the team. And perhaps most telling, every one of them left not with a bang, but with a quiet absence. No more invites, no more collaborations, just a door that slowly closed and stayed that way. These weren't just bad fits, they were cautionary tales. And Rieu, now unburdened by time and expectation, finally told them not to stir drama, but to honor what was lost. Fan reactions explode online. When André Rieu's quiet confessions hit the public, the internet lit up. For a man known for peaceful melodies and a grandfatherly presence, this new chapter felt like a thunderclap. Social media didn't just react, it erupted. Fans who'd followed him for years were stunned. Many had no idea there were tensions behind those cheerful concert videos and flowing ball gowns. On Facebook, longtime listeners posted clips of past shows, zooming in on moments where certain artists looked disconnected, distracted, or slightly offbeat. Suddenly, old footage was being analyzed like court evidence. On Reddit and Twitter, theories exploded. Was this why Hayley Weston disappeared so fast? One post read, "Did Sarah Brightman really remix Blue Danube against Rieu's wishes?" Comment threads stretched hundreds of replies deep as fans tried to piece together timelines, backstage whispers, and interviews that had once seemed benign. Some fans leapt to defend their idols. Katherine Jenkins and Andrea Bocelli supporters pushed back hard, pointing out the lack of public fallout, the continued success of both singers, and the possibility that Rieu's perspective was just one side of a complex story. Others, however, applauded Rieu's honesty. He finally said what so many conductors never dare to say. One YouTube comment read, "The most heartbreaking reactions came from those who felt torn, people who adored both Rieu and the artists he named. I grew up listening to Hayley and André," one fan wrote. "It hurts to hear this, but it also makes sense. You can feel the tension now, watching it back." In the middle of it all, Rieu stayed calm. He released a short statement saying, "This was never revenge, just relief." He clarified that his goal wasn't to tarnish anyone's legacy, but to speak truthfully about what went wrong and why. He also emphasized that these reflections came not from bitterness, but from decades of holding things in. And despite the wave of speculation, he never gave explicit details about each fallout. The names were clear. The stories, still shaded in discretion. That choice gave the revelations a strange power, not in what was said, but in what was implied. The online conversation hasn't stopped. Forums continue to light up. Fans debate, defend, and dissect. But through it all, one thing became clear. The maestro, at 75, had done something rare. He had humanized the myth. Behind the tuxedo and the waltz was a man who had been hurt, who had waited, and who had finally chosen his moment to be heard. And the music world, like his audience, had no choice but to listen. Orchestra loyalty strengthened. As the shockwaves of André Rieu's revelations rippled through the press and fan circles, one group stood silently behind him, the Johann Strauss Orchestra. These weren't just musicians, they were his family on stage, some of whom had traveled the world with him for over 3 decades. They had seen the good shows, the bad ones, and the heartbreaks in between. And when he finally spoke, they didn't flinch. They nodded. Rieu gathered his orchestra soon after the interviews went public. He didn't make a grand speech. He simply said, "I should have protected you more." That sentence, according to one violinist, landed heavier than any applause they'd ever heard. Many of them already knew the tension these guest stars had brought. They'd felt the chill when Anna Netrebko barely made eye contact. They'd noticed the frustration when Russell Watson's rehearsal times kept changing. They remembered the awkward silences after the failed Il Divo collaboration. But they'd never heard Rieu admit the emotional toll, until now. The orchestra responded not with judgment, but support. One cellist reportedly stood up and said, "We always knew you had our backs. Now everyone else does too." That sentiment echoed across the group. Years of quiet frustration were being named, and something about it healed the atmosphere within the ensemble. Internally, changes started happening. A new code of conduct was introduced, focused not just on professionalism, but on respect, communication, and humility. Auditions for future collaborators now included subtle evaluations of personality, not just skill. Rieu himself began sitting in on early rehearsals more frequently, checking not just notes, but vibes. There was no witch hunt, no bitterness, just a shared understanding that the orchestra came first, and anyone who stepped on that stage would need to honor that space, not just with talent, but with grace. From that moment on, Rieu's concerts felt different, tighter, more unified. The orchestra, no longer playing behind him, now played with him. A subtle shift that brought a new kind of magic to the music. And in every performance, even when he didn't speak it out loud, you could feel it. Loyalty had become their loudest note. New rules for future guests. André Rieu was never the kind of man to hold grudges, but he did learn. And after everything he'd experienced, from diva demands to silent betrayals, he decided it was time to protect the space he built. Quietly, but decisively, a new set of rules was drafted for all future collaborators. The guidelines were simple but firm. No special lighting requests, no last-minute setlist changes, no press teams backstage without approval. But more than rules, it was a new mindset. All guest artists now go through a different kind of audition, not just about vocal range or stage presence, but about character. Rieu personally meets with each one, listens, watches, and asks one question that guides his decision. Will this person respect the family I've built? He also brought back mentoring, but only with younger artists who show humility and a willingness to blend in, not stand out. Gone were the days of courting big names for ticket sales. Now it was about shared values. Behind the scenes, the mood changed too. The staff, stagehands, and musicians began feeling more relaxed, more focused. There were no more whispers about someone demanding too much or being cold with the orchestra. That stress was gone, and it showed on stage. Rieu also began using his platform to speak to young musicians more directly. In masterclasses and interviews, he started emphasizing the human side of music, how trust, timing, and temperament mattered just as much as technique. Talent lifts the music. Ego destroys it, he said in one video that quickly went viral. The phrase became something of a mission statement for his later years. These new rules weren't about control. They were about freedom. Freedom to create without tension. Freedom to rehearse without drama. Freedom to perform without wondering what would go wrong behind the curtain. And for Rieu, now in the twilight of his career, that freedom meant everything. At 75, the final transformation. The André Rieu who sat down with journalists at 75 was a different man than the one who danced through waltzes in the early 90s. He still wore the same tailored tux, still smiled at every encore, but there was something else in his voice now: clarity. He wasn't just a performer anymore. He was a man who had seen too much to stay silent. "I no longer bend for applause. I build for legacy," he said quietly during one backstage conversation. And that's exactly what he began doing. His concerts, once grand and festive, took on a more personal tone. He spoke more to the audience, told stories, let them in. The music was still joyful, but now it had layers. You could feel the weight of what he'd carried, and the lightness of finally letting it go. Sponsors, journalists, even former skeptics began to notice. His honesty didn't hurt his brand. It elevated it. The press called this his redemptive era, not because he needed forgiveness, but because he had finally forgiven himself. There were no revenge arcs, no counterattacks, just truth, gentle human truth. And audiences responded. Concerts sold out faster. fan letters poured in. People who had once seen him only as a charming showman now saw the depth behind the bow. He wasn't perfect. He never claimed to be. But at 75, André Rieu was finally whole. An artist who had survived the industry's ego wars with his dignity intact and his orchestra still by his side. "True music lifts hearts, not bruises egos," he said on stage at his anniversary concert. And as the final note echoed into the night, it felt like more than a closing line. It felt like a promise, not just to the audience, but to the music itself. At 75, André Rieu chose honesty over harmony and finally freed himself from silence. His legacy isn't just about music anymore. It's about truth. If you were surprised, shocked, or moved, hit like, drop your thoughts below, and subscribe. More untold stories are waiting, and we're just getting started.